Yeah, let's do it.
Oh wait.
I don't like the last.
I don't know what it is.
No, Helen, where's Helen? Hi, any people? Where's Helen? I think she's not out. What are they on the panel? Who? Charlotte. And he? She's not here. Because she's not so she's there. Right, fine. Tim proposes Sherwin, Judge, are you agreeable to that? Okay, you have no problems? Thank you. No problem. Right, Sherwin! Sherwin, you're in the panel. Right of self-medication. If I'm not mistaken, the motion is about the right of self-medication. Excellent motion so far. Wow. You're so detailed. Yeah, it's so colorful. Oh, really? You want to see? I don't care. I just scored according to speaking. So, my eye, Dixie, Normus, SP. Set it to run. Okay. I'd like to congratulate the teams in the semi-finals in Government SP Tigers Pajamas in our position Dixie Normus. Right. My name is Mick Fab. Handling with me are Athira, Spence, Harvey, Sherwin. On the motion that this House regrets the rise of self-medication, the House invites Prime Minister. Quickly. Sorry. Normal rules, right? Turn off your headphones. Only exit into the room between speeches. That is it. Okay.
What do you have?
That's for comprehensive. Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, a person is no doctor, and doctors are there for a reason, to treat you in every ailment that you necessarily have. When you as a person treat your own medical issues that you have in your body, whether it being light or being heavy necessarily, you don't have any information whatsoever as to what you're doing to yourself. Necessarily, we think that it's extremely harmful when it comes to a person who is not knowledgeable and does not have the qualification that a person who went to 6 years of med school. Our problem and our burdens that we're necessarily going to prove to you in today's debate. 3. Number 1, we're going to prove to you that people, necessarily an average reasonable person like you and me, who are not IMU graduates, who don't have degrees in medicine, necessarily don't have the qualifications to treat themselves just like any other doctors that necessarily exist. Secondly, we're going to prove to you the potential risks and harms that an average reasonable person might face when he or she is treating him or herself. But thirdly and most importantly, that people must not, cannot and should not ever participate in this action, as it's extremely dangerous to begin with. But before I move on to my case, a few clarifications to make this debate much simpler, right? Firstly, what is self-medication, right? Self-medication basically means treating yourself when it comes to diseases or ailments or any injury when it comes to you being medically harmed through your body, right, biologically. It can be arranged, right, to a wide range, from you to simply having a headache from a small matter, or for you to even trying to treat your own body through surgery by your own self, right? We think that these kinds of issues that really exist within status quo, we don't want that necessarily happen within our cases. But let's look at one argument that I have, that people, individuals in general, should not do so because they are not as qualified. But before that,
yeah, so the motion suggests that you regret a rise in self-medication. Before you move on to tell us what are the harms, can you explain the genesis of why there's a rise in the first place?
at the end of the day, people necessarily, something that Kishan wants to talk about, but sure, I'll just bring in a few of a limelight, right? That people necessarily assume that small illness or small treatments can easily be condoned or easily be conducted by necessarily any particular individual. We don't think this is necessarily a problem. I'm going to tell you in my speech why small things not always are necessarily small. They may seem small to an average reasonable person who doesn't have the medical degree that anyone has, but at the end of the day, we don't think it's small. Utterly, it results to your own demise. Something that we don't want to happen to any individual who is not qualified to do so. That's the rise in necessarily occurs, something that we want to regret in this debate. Firstly, what is the nature of an average human being in an average human person? Two things, right? Number one, that an average human being who does not have a doctorate to begin with, has no knowledge whatsoever as to how a particular disease works, as to how a particular ailment happens to, what to do when a particular ailment happens to you, or when an injury hits you when you get knocked into something, right? We think that the basic information, sure, everyone knows what to do in certain situations, right? But we think that in other situations that people still try to treat themselves, they don't have the sufficient knowledge to treat themselves within these circumstances. We don't want that to happen. But secondly, we think that people in nature often assume that their problems are extremely little and easily solvable. We don't think this is necessarily true. And this is natural human nature, that they try to treat their own problems because they assume that these problems are small and therefore try to do so. Second level of analysis. What is the nature of a doctor who is a qualified individual to come and treat you when it comes to these diseases? Firstly, we think that doctor is necessarily a person who knows everything, right? He goes through 6 years of med school or 5 years of med school. At the end of the day, gets a doctorate and is qualified and recognized as a certified practitioner of the law, of the doctorate that he has necessarily in his hand. But secondly, he has more experience than any particular individual necessarily has. So he has any doctor, he or she has a go-to response and knows when to act at a particular time. So if something necessarily happens and you are unaware of the situation, a doctor has a go-to response as to what to do within those circumstances to ensure that you still live another day. No, thank you, Jim. Let's look at the 5 harms that comes to these situations when an individual decides to conduct themselves. Because we think that there's extreme rise within society that people decide to do it on their own because they assume it's easy, or we don't think this necessarily happens. First level of harm, that people necessarily have wrong prescriptions when it comes to medication. No, thank you, Brent. People necessarily have wrong prescriptions when it comes to medication. They assume that medication can be one medication can be used to treat all forms of diseases or either form of the disease. We think that this is necessarily harmful, right? That the type of medication that you take can be wrong and probably would be wrong because you don't have the capacity or that sufficient knowledge to necessarily identify what medication helps which ailment that you necessarily have. That people always do this, assuming they can get away with it. We don't think that's necessarily happens. 2 harms. No, thank you. Firstly, we think that the probability of you taking a medication that harms you probably would kill you or make your ailment much more painful, or your disease or your injury much more worse in circumstances like this. But secondly, you will never know it happens, speaker. You assume that that your disease is treated and your disease is cured, but at the end of the day, no, thank you, you will only suffer when it hits you later on. Second harm, that humans are naturally dismissive in nature. What does this mean? That the people who naturally think about this naturally assume that things are easy to handle, that a simple headache can be cured with a simple piece of Panadol. We think this is extremely wrong. Why? Because symptoms like having a headache could mean just a simple headache, or it could mean a brain tumor in your head, speaker. We think that symptoms are often similar in nature. When you have symptoms that are similar, humans often associate symptoms with the simplest method to cure that pain that you're necessarily having in that particular point in time. Therefore, you are extremely dismissive. I think I might have headache and I take a Panadol, but necessarily I have a brain tumor. Why doesn't this happen when you have a doctor? No, thank you. That a doctor will thoroughly check you, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that you don't have, no, thank you, that no, you don't have any particular problem with situations like this. Therefore, we think that they are qualified. Not they. The third level of analysis, right? That these individuals have harmful treatment methods to begin with. Why this is so? Because treating your ailments in a manner is dangerous because there is no certified individual to look over you when you are committing those actions, when you are treating your own self, right? We think that this is harmful. Why? Sure, you may have the right medication. This is an instance where you do have the right medication, but the method of you putting the medication or the type of treatment that you put onto yourself could be harmful, a risk that you don't want you to take. Why so? Two harms. Number one, that if you treat yourself wrongly, you won't solve the diseases that you necessarily have, that you aim to do to begin with. Even if it's a small ailment, if you treat yourself wrongly, a small cut, you may injure yourself, right? If you don't wash out that cut properly, or if you don't put the necessary measurements, that your cut could get infected and you could have a bigger problem in your hands, right? We think that naturally applies across the board. But the fourth other reason is that individuals like this don't have opinions from other individuals. That humans are naturally utilitarian, unilateral in nature. That they often assume that whatever they've been doing is correct, and therefore they should do it again and again and again and again. Why is this harmful? When you have a doctor to provide you with opinions or methods to solve your problems, or other solutions to solve your problems, you have a certified individual that is recognized by the state to tell you things that are recognized by the state. Therefore, whatever that the doctor is telling you is probably right because he's been doing it all this while and he's been helping a lot of individuals all this while, right? We think that there is no concrete method when you do it on your own. But the last time, and this is the fifth time, the individuals have no proper experience whatsoever. The doctors have these experiences when it comes to reacting to a particular issue that happens to you. That doctors often know what to do and have a go-to response to what happens to you when you do have a problem with your body. Humans who don't have a doctorate don't know that. They often assume that their problems are easy to solve, everything that this caused the rise of that problem. We are very proud to propose, not just because it is harmful, but we think that it's a risk that people should not ever take when it comes to harming their own body. Thank you. Right.
Here?
So, here.
I'd like to invite the leader of opposition.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, from opposition, we believe the conception of self-medication is far beyond and encompasses far more things than what he wanted to say. It's not just about individuals who pop pills for their diseases, but also about individuals who consciously opt out of Western medicine after knowing their symptoms and having been to doctors and choose non-invasive procedures to treat themselves. We don't think it's just about people popping their pills. I have four arguments for you in first opposition. Firstly, the nature of self-medication. Secondly, who's likely to use self-medication and when it's likely to use it. Thirdly, Western medication and its drawbacks. And fourthly, how doctors actually work today and overprescription dependence on drugs and perverse incentives that doctors have. Most of our rebuttals will be integrated, but 2 points will stand out. The first thing that he said is people often don't know anything about the situations they involve themselves in. If you look at the pill popping culture that he wants to talk about, the only pills you actually have an ability to pop are OTC pills, right? Over-the-counter pills, which the FDA or regulatory bodies deem as like not having too many harms in yourself. So things like the common cold, the headache. Everyone in this room, irrespective of whether you have a degree from IMU, knows that you can treat a minor headache with a Panadol. So it's not true that individuals have no common knowledge about whether certain things can be treated with certain things or not. The second thing he said that often you have small headaches, which are actually tumors in the first place, and the progression of the disease which you cannot catch. Sadly, that happens on doctors as well. Like if I go to a doctor with a headache, the first thing that he does is not order an MRI scan, right? So the progression of a disease and the different ways to treat that disease progress as the symptoms become more severe. That happens under both paradigms, not something that's unique to our paradigm. The nature of self-medication, right? Because, Mr. Speaker, side opposition is obviously not going to defend individuals who pop Xanax or illegally procure drugs which are prescription medication, right? The state already deems certain medications which are extremely harmful, for which people don't understand the consequences. Stuff that he talked about. Those things are already not available without prescription. That's not what this debate is about. This debate is about individuals making decisions either to abstain from relying on Western medicine, i.e. individuals who use remedies like acupuncture or palliative care rather than using invasive procedures or harmful medication, as well as individuals who opt out completely after knowing the consequences of taking a certain drug, and individuals who choose not to treat their diseases and self-medicate themselves at home. We're not going to defend illegal procurement, as I already said. Who is likely to use this medication and when? Firstly, it's obviously people who want to opt out of Western medication due to things like religion or culture or their belief in what they believe medical system means. We don't think the government is in any place to force individuals to prescribe to a certain body of medication, because individuals can choose what to do with their own bodies. It's a very simple argument. But secondly, it's often people who suffer moderate symptoms of different psychological conditions, right? If you've seen the rise of ADHD and ADD and stress-related psychological syndromes because of the workplace stress, there are a lot of individuals who choose not to use mind-altering drugs for like for example, Adderall or Ritalin, and rather choose to use things like meditation and not go to a doctor who would often prescribe them these kind of drugs. We think it's completely fine for individuals who don't want to get dependent on mind-altering drugs and want to do far less invasive and you want to use methods which don't make their bodies completely numb. But thirdly, if their diseases are truly life-threatening, right? If the diseases are really like typhoid at its worst stage or cancer, we think there are incentives to go to doctors anyway. These are for two reasons. Firstly, in most cases, there's massive pressure from families and friends who push you to go to a doctor if you're actually at the brink of death. So we don't think individuals try to like have surgeries on themselves when their liver is failing. That's not a realistic situation in any instance. But secondly, there's a massive desire in individuals to preserve yourself. That we think in most instances, given the fact that humans want to prolong their own lives, there's an incentive for you to go to the doctor. There's an incentive for you if your liver is failing to get yourself checked out and try and reach out to a doctor and know what the ways to cure them are. So it's not realistic to say that in worse situations you're not going to go to a doctor. It's likely that you will go to a doctor, he will tell you that this is the way that you can be cured, but there are side effects, and you say, well, I want to opt out of that because that's too invasive or deteriorates the quality of my life. That brings me on to my second argument. Western medicine and its drawbacks. Because we will contend from side opposition that there is far too much focus on the preservation of life in Western medicine versus quality-adjusted life years. What do I mean by this? The fact that doctors often push on cancer patients things like radioactive therapy or chemotherapy, things which may cure them in a medical sense but have massive side effects and debilitate the lives of these individuals. In most Western countries, states force individuals to take these treatments, right? The fact that you often become a warden of the state if you choose not to opt in, the state can force you to undergo treatment. The fact that in the US, doctors need to sign off before you leave a hospital and you try to strap out things and leave the hospital in the first place. We think individual autonomy is completely forgotten when states force individuals to live painful lives under the side effects of treatments which they don't want to opt into. We think it's far better if individuals can, even if cancer, die in 10 years having lived a meaningful life rather than have lived 30 years in pain when Western medication force them to do this. We think that's bad. We want to protect individuals who want to opt out. Yes?
Sir, if your argument is that these individuals have no other choice to opt for radiotherapy and chemotherapy, why not make that law and regulate that law, increasing their choice and letting them die?
So that's what we're saying. We're saying that there are, like in most instances, doctors force invasive treatments on people. People don't want to do this and want to self-medicate themselves at home, and that's fine. Thirdly, overprescription and dependence on drugs. Because we will say that there's a massive pressure from pharma companies in status quo who lobby doctors to push as many drugs on individuals as possible. You've seen the rise of pharma companies as the entry cost into the industry decrease, and you have a large number of pharma companies who compete in the same market. They lobby doctors massively by paying for their trips, giving them gifts, or often paying them money to prescribe drugs to individuals. There's been an exponential rise in the number of people being prescribed medication for mild psychological symptoms which could be treated without using these drugs. We think there are often dangerous side effects of neurochemicals which alter the individuals like brain cells and shit, which could have been dealt with without using this medication. The fact that doctors often overplay the symptoms of their disease and prescribe medication due to the lobbying efforts means that individuals are often pushed towards mind-altering stuff which could have been dealt otherwise. We think that's a problem because people often develop dependencies on these drugs and experience side effects which the doctors never told them about because there was an incentive for doctors to hide this, so more medication would be bought. We think that's a bad thing. But thirdly, in Western liberal democracies, and this is very important, insurance companies often pay for your treatment and customers never really see the cost of that treatment. The biggest criticism of the NHS in the UK is because the government pays and the customer doesn't pay anything, doctors often push way more tests and invasive procedures than are required because they make the most money out of them. It's easy to do this because the customer never faces the cost and the government does this. There are two harms to this. The first harm is obviously the harm to the patients who often undergo extremely harmful and invasive procedures with massive side effects just because the doctor wanted to push them on this. But secondly, doctors waste resources because it's a zero-sum game. You redirect resources towards individuals who are gullible, force them into treatments because you can make money from the government, and someone else who probably deserves that money doesn't get it because it's a zero-sum game. Because we uphold the autonomy of individuals and protect individuals from doctors who are extremely evil and extremely proud to do this.
Prime Minister.
Aditya started his speech by telling you that people and naturally individuals have a right and are incentivized to self-abstain themselves from Western medication. But then went on to contradict himself by telling us that families and friends within Western liberal democracies always push individuals towards taking Western medication. We didn't see how these two things work together. He had 4 arguments, and the first one was on how individuals and their the nature of self-medication. Second, he tried to tell us that who would want to take the self-medication. The first one, the nature of self-medication. He tried to tell us that these individuals have a right to abstain themselves from medication. But then at the end of his argument, he tried to tell us they have the right to go and medicate themselves at home. We saw no form of characterization as to how he expected them to medicate themselves at home when he has already pushed our characterization as to how we told you. They do pop pills with their mouths and they do things like stitch themselves, right? Within status quo, these are active things that are being done by individuals who are not being recommended by doctors because of the severe harms that can occur during those kinds of times. The second argument, because he tried to tell us that these individuals who are going to do this are individuals and whereby the government is forcing you as an individual to take that form of treatment. Things like cancer, chemotherapy and radiotherapy, because you as an individual have no free will. There is not a problem with individuals wanting to take self-form of medication. That's a problem with regulation and the relationship between the state and its individuals. If you can give individuals that form of choice and respect them and give them all the side effects of these forms of treatments, these individuals can make well and rational choices. That isn't an argument in today's debate. But the third one, he tried to tell us the Western medication within status quo is already suppressive, where in UK, individuals such as normal people, their medication is being paid for. At the end of the day, they have no other option but to take their form of medication. Within the status quo, we have a diverse amount of medication and treatments that you as a person can take. It's your choice as to how you use that leverage the government funds all your form of medical treatment. We don't think there is no choice at all. You as a person has that choice at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker. We want to be the ones who are humane in this debate. But then they try to tell us, you know what, doctors are being paid into doing these forms of things and prescribing these forms of medication. That's why you have things like the FDA to approve medication in the first place for the very first fact that if this is being done, that's illegal. The law already regulates this. If pharmaceutical companies are trying to lobby these doctors into doing something, we can strictly regulate, and the FDA already regulates what drug can be sold to who and what drug can't. So we don't see necessarily problem under their paradigm. We didn't see that. But the one rebuttal who he had to my Prime Minister was two actually. This first, that these individuals don't know, because he tried to say the common cold and a headache can be easily solved by anybody within status quo. The very fact that you're assuming that it's a common cold already shows the lack of knowledge that every individual has that has not gone through that 6 years of medical school. But the second rebuttal, because he tried to tell us that these individuals who have small headaches, somehow doctors already dismiss your problems. Because you tell them you have a headache, they don't do a full MRI scan on you. The probability of us getting the MRI scan under our paradigm as compared to you getting nothing at all, even advice from a doctor, is already dismissive. Because you're debating in a vacuum. If you compare both the paradigms, under one paradigm, you have circumstances where individuals who have brain tumors in their heads are consistently going to eat Panadols, but under the other paradigm, a well-certified doctor who can distinguishingly tell which symptom suits which disease, we think that logic already falls on its own. A bit later, I have 3 arguments for you today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the continuous lack of awareness that occurs within individuals who try to avoid hospitals based on their propaganda. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the traditional medicine that already is within this debate because they didn't want to talk about it. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about devaluing the research that government heavily funded upon. For that, yes.
Okay, if you have progressive symptoms of an extremely dangerous disease, what are the people like you characterize likely to do? Those who just self-medicate because of unaware. You think the fact that there are progressive symptoms, they're likely to go to a doctor if the symptoms become worse?
That argument is being dismissive. Because at the end of the day, on one hand, you're principally telling us that self-medication is good, but then you push the argument away by just telling us, you know what, they'll still go to doctors. Side opposition needs to find a direction in this debate, either to tell us that these people need to self-medicate themselves or these people need to go to doctors. We didn't see one from the leader of opposition. My first argument, the continuous lack of awareness. Being self-medicated naturally means these individuals do keep themselves out of hospitals because of their personal opinions or the Western propaganda that side opposition tried to tell us. The harm to this is the perception that you place on individuals, or the perception that goes around within society, is that I will only go to a hospital if there's severe amounts of pain. Something they wanted to talk about. What is the problem with this? And when you have that perception as an individual that I can only go to a doctor when I don't have the proper medical equipment, when I don't have the proper medical advice, at the end of the day, there's two harms. The problem with time sensitivity, where we should always direct an individual who's sick towards a doctor to ensure that they get the best form of treatment. The second form of harm is you devalue the very fact that a doctor is actually specialized to cure these forms of problems, because whether it's large or small, these individuals should be directed towards doctors to gain that form of medical help that they so direly need. Because at the end of the day, under your paradigm, with the advanced medicals, with the advancement of medicine within our status quo, these individuals will be left out of the box, because at the end of the day, they're going to continuously self-medicate themselves and won't get any form of advice from doctors. We don't necessarily think this is beneficial. We believe that they should go to doctors. This rise of culture is bad. No, I gave you a chance. The second substantive, traditional medicine. Cultural forms of medicine in itself are done by practitioners who are specialized. Like the traditional Chinese medicine board, which approves certain forms of medication, and these individuals who are actually professionals in actually doing these forms of cures and actually trying to get rid of diseases. The problem with this is, if you as an individual are trying to self-medicate yourself with traditional medicine, at the end of the day, the severe harms are that it's inaccountable. You as a person can suffer from irreversible harms rather than seeing a professional individual who's certified by an actual board. At the end of the day, when it comes to these forms of circumstances, whether it's traditional or not, or traditional or modern forms of medicine, at the end of the day, you need to see a person, because you're the person who will be inflicting that same harm upon yourself. So they can't deal with traditional medicine in circumstances, in treatments like snake grass treatment, where these things are heavily done by professionals who can actually cure you of your tumor. At the end of the day, they are fine with people doing this on their own, because they think, you know what, it's just something simple. But the second, my last argument, devaluing the research society, the government has consistently done. What does this mean? We've put heavy funding into trying to cure these forms of diseases. Heavy funding into curing things like AIDS or cancer. And so we provide you a diverse amount of treatments to every other individual who survives that form of disease. Under their paradigm, they assume that everybody can just dismiss these forms of diseases because they think it's not important. So government thinks that every disease and every form of treatment that should be there should be considered by everybody, not just thinking about self-medicating themselves. We believe that every individual who is experienced to medicate themselves and medicate others should be allowed to do so, irregardless. You're inflicting harms upon yourself and you're following the propaganda that they try to support. If you support individuals in staying in a healthy life and continuing with this support, it's like government.
Right, I would like to invite Deputy to opposition.
Mr. Speaker, self-medication grants agency to the individual. It allows individuals to explore alternative treatments outside of Western medicine. A reliance on doctors makes medical decisions subject to individuals to moneyed interests, lobby groups, overburdened medical systems, and novel treatments that may work in the short term, but have long-term side effects that aren't known until years after their release. I have 2 points to bring to you today. First, the goals of medication, and second, why self-medication creates a more informed population. Before that, I have 7 points of rebuttal. First point of rebuttal, small symptoms can actually lead to massive problems. We already pointed out it's a non-unique harm because it happens in the status quo, because doctors use Occam's razor when making determinations. They're not going to put you into a CAT scan machine if you have a headache. But secondly, as the severity of symptoms increases, individuals are likely to step up to familiar pressure. Keeshan called this a contradiction, but sometimes Keeshan doesn't actually engage in rebuttal and just accuses people of contradiction. So let's look at what this actually is. What the contradiction is not, what we're saying is that people are likely to stop self-medicating if they self-medicate without the guidance of a doctor and their symptoms become more severe. At the point at which they go to see a doctor due to familial pressure, if they're say, like, if it turns out they have a brain tumor, they can still self-medicate that brain tumor, right? Like, all they're doing is going to a doctor to find out what's wrong with them. You can still self-medicate either before the counsel of a doctor or after the counsel of a doctor. That's what we're saying. It's not a contradiction. Third point of rebuttal, people stitch themselves and that sucks. All right, well, this is a really silly argument. That's an argument for cheaper healthcare. Like, people don't stitch themselves because they conscientiously object to stitches. They do it because they're expensive and it's poor. That argument's irrelevant. Fourth point of rebuttal, that choice exists in the status quo and individuals have the agency to go to all different doctors all the time. Not true for several reasons. First, several insurance companies make it so you can only see certain kinds of doctors, like HMO providers, or in the NHS, only certain doctors who are subject to contracts with certain drug companies. So it's not true on its face. But second, people defer to doctors who are under tremendous financial pressure and who belong to a hospital that may have contracts with certain pharmaceutical companies. So this illusion of choice that Keishan paints for you is idealistic, but it's not factually true. Fifth point of rebuttal, that there's some misperception that people will only seek treatment for severe pain. This is also silly. Why? We never said that we're making a normative judgment about individuals who opt into medicine, so this isn't actually the debate. We're not forcing people to self-medicate. What we're doing is celebrating people who do opt to self-medicate. We're not telling you that you should go off and tell everyone all the time they should self-medicate. We are celebrating the rise of self-medication. He took the debate too far. That's not what we're talking about. Sixth, cultural medicine is unaccountable. Not true. Cultural medicine is accountable to the community. If people are dying of snake oil treatments because like some traditional Chinese medical doctor was prescribing it, if those patients are dying, that guy loses legitimacy. No one will go to him any longer. Seventh and final point of rebuttal, and the most important point of rebuttal, actually. There's this idea all along government bench that Western medicine has all the answers, and the FDA is this benevolent overseer that always does things that are awesome, and the FDA is perfect. Why is that not true? First, the FDA is massively overburdened and frequently doesn't look at the data as thoroughly as it ought to. But secondly, and more importantly, long-term side effects are often unknown. For example, prescribing prescription-strength Tylenol combined with blood pressure medication leads to massive liver damage. But unfortunately, we didn't know this until 30 years after we approved people taking Tylenol with blood pressure medication. The trials aren't long enough to determine the long-term interests. In game theory, this is known as unknown unknowns. People, when they're mixing different medications or they're taking new drugs, there's unknown unknowns. Like, we don't know what we don't know about the drugs. Opting out of unknown unknowns is a perfectly legitimate choice for an individual to make. For example, if a doctor prescribes me a new drug that was approved by the FDA, that drug, 30 years down the line, might result in brain cancer, but we don't know that. Me being prudent and opting out of that system and instead relying on self-medication is a perfectly legitimate choice that ought to be preserved. They can't just tell you that the FDA categorically approves things prudently all the time, because that's demonstrably false later. First point, what are the goals of medication? Mr. Speaker, we believe normatively that medication, whether it's self-medication or prescriptive medication, should be focused on treating the whole person. Unfortunately, Western medicine has a very narrow concept of the person. Western medicine sees persons as fleshy sacks of cells and blood, and we can use numbers, tests, and data to fix this fleshy sack of cells and bloods. Western medicine is designed to ensure that the sacks that are our bodies are functioning properly. But this is a very narrow conception of what the person is and what medication, broadly speaking, ought to be focused on. Treating your cholesterol or high blood pressure ought to involve more than just like going to a doctor, getting Celebrex, and continuing your unhealthy lifestyle. When you have a reliance on Western medication, you think that taking this magical pill is going to cure me, you ignore a lot of other legitimate treatments. So what we say is that self-medicating with things like taking Revisitrol, which is the active ingredient in red wine, which like may or may not actually have benefits, but most people think it does, and using mindfulness exercises. These types of self-medications, even if they don't improve like the sacks of flesh and blood as much as, say, Western medicine would, it's treating the whole person. It allows an individual to change their lifestyle and take ownership over their bodies. Go ahead.
This debate includes more than just individuals opting out of Western medicine. That's why I talk about traditional forms of medicine, which is not neglected. That means you're going to support people who are opting out of Western medicine that you're criticizing. You're also supporting people who are opting out of traditional forms of medicine and Asian forms of medicine.
Sure. Two responses. First, again, you give us examples like people stitching themselves up, which is completely ridiculous and irrelevant. Like, make stitching cheaper. The next example you provide is traditional medicine, which you assert by fiat with no justification that there's zero accountability, when in fact there is accountability because these traditional medicine providers are accountable to the communities that they're providing care to. Frequently you have a long-term relationship you've built with a traditional medicine provider, and if that medical provider undermines your trust and damages you, they're going to lose that accountability. You can't make declarations by fiat and pass them off as substantiated claims. That's not how debate works. So what we would say is that self-medication looks at the whole person when deciding to treat them. Individuals may look to things like lifestyle. The perception of betterment is an important conception in this debate. If you want to go through chemotherapy for 5 years and suffer your hair falling out and suffer the psychological damages that result from doctors focused on making your sack of organs and blood cells better, you might damage yourself in the long term. But if you see yourself as a whole person, as a mother who has to provide for her children, as a brother who has to provide for his younger sister, and you want to ensure that your hair is not falling out, and you take a principled stance, that's a legitimate choice. if you choose to self-medicate, you take ownership over your body and choose to see yourself as a holistic person and not simply a fleshy sack of organs, that is a legitimate choice for anyone to make in a Western liberal democracy. Final substantive point. Why does self-medication create a more informed population? The fact that we're even having this debate suggests that self-medication is a controversial issue and a matter of grave public concern. The scientific community is very interested in investigating the prudence or effectiveness of these treatments. The rise of self-medication, which is what we're talking about, means that there's an increasing pervasiveness of individuals opting into this system, and there's a lot more alternatives out there. What does this mean? It means Western medicine is going to analyze this, and it's going to see which is effective. This is going to have one of two consequences. It's either A, going to grant legitimacy to alternative medicines, or B, Western medicine will adopt these practices and augment itself in a sort of relationship between prescriptive medication and self-medication. Because we see individuals more holistically than government, because we actually understand how medication and doctors actually work, we're extremely proud to propose.
Right. I'd also like to invite the last speaker for the government, the government whip.
The problem with the principle of self-medication is that you create a hierarchy where the decision of that you take to self-medicate yourself is the one that is correct. The hierarchy that you take or the decision that you take to self-medicate yourself is always the one that will minimize the harm or create that form of bodily autonomy or whatever independence that Brett talked about. Those kind of things are worse, will get worse off if you don't listen to the principle that we propagate now. If you listen to yourself or you have some form of independence that we are fine with, that you can have the number of independence that you want, you can believe that the organs in yourself are worth of heaven, we don't care. But we tell you that if you don't listen to the principle or you don't follow the principle of not self-medicating yourself, there will be reciprocations and there will be a detrimental harm towards you. That's the same principle of not listening to like for example, like things like global warming deniers. The same way, if you the harms that will rise without that principle in itself is something that we don't agree with. That's why we tell you that the principle should be pushed forward. There are two issues in today's debate. First of all, on the idea of implementation, have a seat, on the implementation of self-medication, on practicality in itself, and secondly, analyzing the ideas of corporations and pharmaceutical companies and the capital that they play, because this was the problem they talked about. Before I move on to my first issue, any clarification? No. Okay. The first issue about how the implementation of self-medication on practicality. Yeah.
Imagine you have a disease like cancer. Is it okay for the state to pull you out of your house, take you to a hospital, and give you a cocktail of drugs that you definitely don't want to take?
You see, the same way how doctors can overstep parents in court, where to make the decision whether the child should get a surgery or not, the same way, the harm that you will get without listening to a medical professional, because you are no medical graduate in itself, is to show you that that knowledge or that experience in itself that you gain is something that we should stand for. The same way, you believe in people, you believe that self-medication is something that you should stand for, or you should opt out of Western medication, or you should opt out from traditional medication, is that they take things into their hands. The same way that like when you have traditional medication in your hand, you're not going to go to the Chinese ginseng uncle down the road, is that you're going to buy a bottle of oil and hurt yourself, or you will not know that you hurt yourself until you apply that ointment onto yourself. These are things that will actually happen if you allow for self-medication and the rise that's already happening because of the populist democracy that we are living in. The ideas ideas that they talked about were, number one, they talked about things like progression of diseases will still happen, because even when you go to the doctor, the first thing that he's going to do is not going to put you on an MRI scan, obviously, because the signs and symptoms that you propagate is not going to be something that you have a brain cancer or you have a brain tumor in your head. It's just that you show you if the signs and symptoms as experience of doctors. Doctors have experience. Doctors know how to treat patients and which kind of patients, of how to treat them. These kind of things are already in the fingertips of doctors, which will show them which kind of treatment or which kind of treatment to give you for which kind of diseases. Just because they don't put you on an MRI scan for you for having a headache, is that they know that the headache will not be rise up to a problem that will cause detrimental harm or will be a harmful disease in itself. It's just that you don't know that, because if you don't go to a doctor, the same decision that you make as every average other reasonable person out there is that it's a minor headache, I can take Panadol, Actifast, and it will go up. These are the likelihood that it will never form any form of success in itself. What's the harm if by going to a doctor and spending a few pennies into having the doctor's treatment in itself? But if you don't go to the doctor and you don't get the treatment, that harm or the money that you will have to spend or the treatment that you have to go through is far even worse. That's something that we are not willing to stand for. Have a seat, sir. The second level of this issue is that what they talked about, like the ideas like taking medication and having side effects and so on and so forth. Yes, we agree. Because of the diversity in human body, and not everyone can agree with every other medication out there. That doesn't mean that Western medication or medication as a whole is something that you should not stand for as a principle in itself. Because this is the system that you create. It's just that certain form of Western medication doesn't agree with you. You diminish the idea that every other Western medicine or the doctor in itself is an evil person, as Aditya quoted. We don't believe in these kind of situations because the accountability is still with the hospital, the accountability is still with the doctor, and you don't stand for that accountability. But before that, sure.
Your Prime Minister's entire speech showed that qualification necessitated subscription. But yet you allow people to go to modern medicine and modern hospitals and yet still choose not to opt into medical treatment.
Sir, let's take professional negligence for example. The idea of not doing as much harm as to do good for me is already to show you that we'll try to mitigate the amount of harm even though we don't make you God. We tell you that even if the ideas of not making you come out as a healthy person, or we try to reduce the pain that you have, like using morphine or so on and so forth, these kind of extreme cases which you don't understand for. Because the minute you don't believe in Western medication, or the minute you don't believe in any form of medication itself, that you want to go to that medication or that type of medication for any other reason, and so on and so forth. Like, except when you have like an emergency or so on and so forth. So we tell you that if the idea of going for to Western medication, even if you have an emergency, or even if you can't self-medicate yourself because the injury is too far severe, then why not extend this principle or show people that you should go there even from the start, not only when the signs and symptoms are getting even worse. The second level to this idea is that they talked about things like traditional medication and how it's a legitimate choice to make because you feel that your body is more important and you want to save yourself from things like the side effects or doctor's manipulation and so on and so forth. People can have that belief. We don't care if you believe in yourself or whatsoever. We tell you that the things that they take into works for only minimal risk. Let's take an example of traditional medication. Yes, if you take that ointment, it might solve your headache, but you don't know what will come out of that headache or itself, or what that ointment make will that ointment make your headache worse in itself. These kind of things that normal average people, or average reasonable people don't understand, and these kind of things that which medical professionals and government have to push for. That's why we stand for this principle. The second level of issue of the analyzing corporations and pharmaceutical companies, because what they told you, there is no regulation. Insurance companies monopolize these kind of people and they lobby doctors and so on and so forth. These kind of things, it's a different problem in itself, because they admitted that the problem is never about people getting the right form of treatment, is that doctors are misusing the power that they have, insurance companies are misusing the power that they have. That's why Kishan told you, and I will tell you, that the regulation has to be pushed forward. We increase the number of regulation because it is time that doctors and insurance companies realize that healthcare is not something that we play for. That's why we give free healthcare, because we believe that everyone should get healthcare, no matter if you can get the Panadol for free or not. The number one principle is that first A, no matter whether you're a doctor who is driven by profit, because most doctors are driven by biodata or the professional, like the number of surgeries that they're success in, because the more number of surgeries you screw up, the lesser people that will come to you. But the difference is that there are various number of doctors, different doctors that specialize in different things. You have the choice on which doctor you want to choose to. We stand for doctors, we stand for medical professionals. For all those reasons, please cite this.
Okay. Last speaker, opposition whip.
We've never discounted the possibility or the known fact that the medical institution has much more information about ailments, and therefore it is probably a better option for people to subscribe to. But what they discounted in this instance is that opting out of that particular system is a legitimate choice for people to naturally make if they choose to not be subjected to the overprescription and the overdependency of drugs and they want to self-medicate. We've never heard of why it is a legitimate choice or why it is illegitimate for people to discount themselves from that particular instance. So 3 things to talk to you about. Number 1, is it a legitimate choice to opt out of the system? Secondly, what are the kinds of information are we talking about here? And thirdly, the legitimacy of Western medication and what are its drawbacks that generally just went totally dismissed by government. So firstly, is it legitimate to opt out? The problem with the Prime Minister's speech was the qualification of or the necessity of his subscription was totally dependent on the qualification of doctors. Everything you heard from the Prime Minister was that doctors are more qualified, the medical institution knows best, and therefore, as an individual who is sick, you must subscribe to it. The first thing we will tell you that this compulsion is false, because essential services like healthcare has always been a choice-based system. It is always dependent on your subscription. So we don't think the yardstick of qualification of doctors or the efficacy of doctors in this instance necessitates your subscription in the first place. But secondly, when it comes to modern medicine as well, you still can choose to opt out. Why? Because even if you subscribe to yourself to a general practitioner, or you go to a hospital, after receiving all that information, the choice is still yours in whether to undergo those forms of treatment or go back home to self-medicate. Doctors and hospitals still give you that choice of not subscribing to their treatments. The choice is ultimately yours, so we think it is a choice at the end of the day. Secondly, we also told you that this is also dependent upon people's cultural beliefs and personal beliefs. They never wanted to deal with this, where people can abdicate out of these types of systems. The point in which they needed to win this debate was to answer a very important question. This means said, at what point does Western qualifications in medicine supersede your cultural beliefs or supersede your cultural intent to subscribe to a particular system or a particular form of treatment? We never heard the rational calculus of people on why it needs to be totally dependent upon Western qualifications and the point in which it supersedes any form of cultural beliefs, and we think that is problematic. But thirdly, they said, and we heard this throughout the bench, even in Evelyn's speech, right? It's dependent upon a rational decision of people to make the best informed choice. The problem with your rationality is that your rationale is totally dependent on the qualification of medicine, where we think that is not always the rationale or the calculus that people take into account when making medical decisions. You heard from Brett and extensively in Aditya as well, that it's more of the quality of life versus the preservation of life. The problem with modern medicine and Western medicine is that there's a huge amount of focus that's going into the preservation of life, even if it comes at the expense of the quality of life that you might live. And this is the types of moral judgment calls that medical institutions can't make. Individuals have to make those decisions for themselves. There's already precedence for this, right? Because when you subscribe to yourself to Western medication or you go to a hospital, the decision ultimately is yours of whether you want to have that surgery or go back home and live a peaceful life until you die. The reason is because the mental calculus of choosing the types of quality of life you want to pre or post surgery or pre or post any form of treatment is ultimately yours. So we think the rational decision that you are trying to make is so long as people subscribe to Western medication, it's a rational decision. We don't think so. I'll take the win.
So the problem is that you discourage the Western medication, or you discourage any form of treatment that they want to, because you only propagate the idea of self-medication in any way they want to.
No. It's not a form of discouragement. The choice is ultimately yours in terms of which subscription you choose to allow yourself to be forced to. So if it's Western medication and if you think that the doctors know best and you want to subscribe to yourself to those fine treatment, we're fine with it. But you distort the rise of the celebrations of self-medication for people who choose to opt out of the Western medication, and that's why we have a problem. Secondly, the kinds of information you're dealing with. We told you, that, and we think this is fundamentally problematic, right? Where the characterization was that people who choose to self-medicate just generally don't have an awareness of the kind of benefits doctors can bring them or the medical institution can bring them. We think the people who choose to self-medicate are fully aware of the benefits of going to Western medication and the benefits that the hospitals can bring them, but still choose to opt out of it. But Brett also told you, people also do this out of fear, because they fear the unknown of what the unknowns of what they don't know, or what the medical institution don't know as well. And we think any form of decision that's based on this fear is a perfectly legitimate choice, because your quality of life is dependent on the outcome of that particular decision as well. So even if you fear the unknowns of what the medical institution can't bring you, we need to hear why that was an illegitimate form of choice, and we did it. But secondly, we also told you any form of self-medication is self-regulatory in nature. The fact that it's dubbed the rise of self-medication shows you a certain degree of efficacy within this paradigm as well. Any form of traditional medicine is also business-based. Right? People generally want to sell their medication. Right? Any form of any people who generally sell these types of medication also make a business out of it. It is also a competition. So we don't think they'll sell dodgy medication. It's a self-regulating mechanism. People are generally not going to subscribe to a system that ultimately kills them if there's precedents to follow. So we think that rise shows a certain degree of efficacy. But lastly, the legitimacy of Western medication, and this is where we distort this whole idea of qualification necessitates subscription. The first thing we've told you is that pharma companies generally lobby doctors. That's what they're meant to do. There is a high tendency of over-prescription and an over-dependency of drugs. Is that a system that we want to deal with? Perhaps not. But people have a choice of whether they want to allow themselves to be under those forms of paradigms where they're dished out with these types of medication. Kishan came and said that FDA companies can choose the kinds of drugs that are out there. They choose the quality and they determine exactly what drugs they put out there. They don't control the quantity of drugs that doctors generally prescribe to people. They don't control the over-dependency of drugs that people are generally subjected to. Last one, go.
The contradiction that you made on your side is that you consider self-medication a medication that is a choice by anybody to offer medicine. That means under your paradigm, if someone opt into Western forms of medication, that's self-medication, and that's what you consider. After all, the criticism of self-medication.
No, I think we've been pretty clear about the definition. I think self-medication is when you choose to not subscribe to a hospital or a doctor, where you choose to treat yourself in the home, and the converse is generally you go into a doctor patient, like a bit too late for definitional problems here. Secondly, where we told you also, like in states like the UK, where we generally pay doctors where the state generally pays doctors, it's a perverse incentive for doctors to continuously keep you in hospitals far longer than you need to be, because they want to make the most amount of money by keeping you there. These are all the perverse incentives to doctors. Now, do we distort the qualification of doctors or the efficacy of doctors? No, but there are perverse incentives for the medical institution to take advantage of a system to make as much money from you. Again, this is also a choice. If you choose to do so, and if you choose to be at the whims and fancies of these doctors, it's a perfectly legitimate choice. But for them to tell us that you need to be under the system and you need to subject yourself to such perversion is fundamentally wrong. But lastly, we also told you there are already incentives in place for people to generally subscribe to general medicine, where you've got pressure from families or if you're really suffering from great amounts of ailment. The problem is this: at what point does Western qualification of medicine supersede your intent or your ability to choose the kinds of medication you want to subscribe yourself to? We didn't hear it proposed.
Okay. Now into the summation part of the debate. We'd like to invite the opposition to present a reply.
Before I summarize this debate in 2 questions, I want to look at this debate from a meta level and point out a catastrophic error that side government made. Let's look at the motion. This House regrets the rise of self-medication. The motion places a burden on government teams to make a normative judgment about individuals who opt into self-medication. They tried to put a burden on us by claiming that we were somehow making normative judgments about people who still opt into Western medicine, telling them proscriptively they should never go to a doctor and rely upon Western medication. That wasn't our burden. We didn't have to do that. They tried creating new burdens for us. Clever strategy, but it didn't work. We celebrate the choice individuals have to use their conception of personhood to inform decisions about what treatments are prudent for them. Perhaps an individual doesn't want to be like the person in Nimalan's speech who's taken out of their home because they refuse to engage in treatment. Perhaps an individual sees themselves as a mother, brother, sister, daughter, or wife that has obligations that extend beyond preserving the sacky flesh of organs and blood that comprise your body. That's the meta level of this debate. That's why they fail. I have 2 questions that summarize this debate. First, is self-medication harmful? And second, is Western medicine a panacea? On the first point, is self-medication harmful? From government, we hear that self-medication is harmful because it's not as effective at fixing your body, the fleshy bits, right? Nimalan said that it's so important, in fact, that governments are justified in making you a warden of the state and forcing treatment upon you. Massively problematic when Nimalan concedes that. Because medicine is focused so much on your body, it neglects the other components of personhood. We had several responses to their conception. The first is that their conception isn't actually necessarily true. Many forms of self-medication are actually effective. Aditya told you in his speech that people who suffer from mild to moderate depression don't benefit substantially more from taking selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors as doing mindfulness exercises, exercising, and improving their diet. So in marginal cases, what we see is that the choice to self-medicate can actually be as effective. But our second response was that this is a very narrow conception of the person, because taking someone out of their home and forcing them to undergo chemotherapy ignores the fact that that individual's conception of the good life might not include like going to the hospital and being subject to chemotherapy. Their conception of the good life might be standing strong for their kids, allowing the cancer to take hold of them, and meeting death in a way that they feel is comfortable to them. They might self-medicate with palliative care to make it so they can get through the day and make it so they can provide for their children, but they might want to set an example that exists outside of the arena of Western medicine. Because Western medicine is so myopic, Western medicine does not need to be forced upon individuals. But third, we said that self-medication takes into consideration unknown unknowns. There was no response to this. When individuals are unsure of how combining different drugs or how the long-term effects of drugs may affect them, it's perfectly reasonable for them to make an informed choice in opting out of those systems. Final question, is Western medicine a panacea? The government claims that legitimacy can only exist when it comes from a licensed medical professional who prescribes treatment. What we told you is that being a medical professional is not a necessary condition of making prudent medical decisions. We told you this all up and down our bench. First, we said that doctors are subject to moneyed interests that limit choice and sometimes create perverse interests. Second, we told you that drug companies have an incentive to sell drugs, and in instances such as ADHD, depression, there's an overprescription problem that, at best, is expensive and unnecessary, and at worst, is harmful because we don't understand how the modification of your neurochemistry can affect you in the long term. We also told you that Western medicine values length of life over quality of life. It doesn't take into consideration the profound and important and personal experiences that inform a person's conception of the good life. That was a tongue twister, sorry. And after the whole talk about like ginseng uncle doctors, I just like had to stumble over that. I also finally told you that we improved Western medicine because we started an organic conversation between individuals who choose to self-medicate and the Western medicine and scientists who adjudicate that self-medication. Because we actually improve medication, because we actually understand what makes a person, and because we're not forcing anybody to do anything and we're empowering choice, we think OP wins this debate.
Right. Last speech of the semifinals. Government reply.
Opposition had multiple definitions as to what self-medication necessarily means. Initially, in Aditya's speech, he told you that self-medication is anything that you opt out of a system, and therefore we ran with that. And then Tim came up and told you that self-medication is anything I choose to do, necessarily harming their case in itself. Anything I choose to do, meaning if I choose to opt into Western medication, therefore you're also okay with that under our paradigm. This is a contradiction that came under their case. We don't think that this should stand throughout this debate. Opposition lives in a world where self-medication necessarily is almost perfect, and we think that this is wrong. They try to dismiss this debate by giving us harms of Western medication, not necessarily telling us why self-medication in itself is far better than Western medication to begin with. We don't think that's something to do so. But how do we respond to the fact that Western medication is harmful, and how did we win this debate through this matter? Two responses we provide to you initially from our second speaker, right? First, we told you that Western medications don't necessarily lobby. In Indian speech and Christians, we told you that Western medications often try to have the primary aim of making individuals feel good about themselves and feel healthier as an individual to begin with. Profit-oriented is not there. Therefore, you need a regulation, something that we all extensively talked about. But the second level, second response that we already had blocked throughout this debate is that just because one Western medication suits someone wrongly, it doesn't mean that all forms of Western medication is harmful across the board. Something that Nimran talked about, which is severely dismissed by Tim into our debate. How do we respond to the issues that they brought here to this debate? Firstly, they talked about cultural impacts, how individuals have a right to go through cultural impacts, and how necessarily it's beneficial to them. First level of the response, we told you it's a contradiction. That cultural impacts, if it's so strong to them, they would never ever opt into a doctor, no matter how severe the disease that necessarily exists within them. Therefore, if Aditya told you that they will opt in at the end of the day, that means they're strong or grasp towards their cultural impact is not necessarily strong to begin with. But secondly, we told you how cultural methods necessarily is dangerous because you are not accountable to everyone. Sure, they can tell you that you are accountable to the ginseng uncle, but necessarily if you are the individual that made that oil yourself and you harmed your own self in a situation like this, you are accountable to your own actions. And that is not something we want to individuals to suffer within a circumstance like that. Second level of response. We talked about how Western drugs necessarily how they're dangerous. We've provided multiple responses. Firstly, we told you that it's not harms of Western drugs, but harms of not regulating the drugs and the dispersity of those drugs in situations like this. Something that we brought to you that had no counter response. We think that was extremely disappointing. But even if so, there's a trade-off that's justified, right? We think there's a trade-off, we do so. But let's look at how we responded to unknown unknowns, because the Brett want to talk about it so much. We already responded to it from this debate. Unknown unknown is not knowing something that will necessarily happen to you. It also happens under their side, where you're not knowing about the consequences of an action that is not regulated by any professional within situations like this. And unknown, gone unknown. But the last issue, and then it told you that FDA isn't a proper arbitrator and they made mistakes. He's pinching upon a small mistake the FDA made, ignoring the multiple contributions the FDA has already made in the past, something they've already responded to for this case. But the last issue that we responded to is that Brett told you that self-medication is anything, medication is anything that has a goal to treat yourself. We don't think so. Your intent may be good to treat yourself, but do the consequences meet your intent of your action? We don't think so. Those consequences are necessarily harmful. They could lead to death. Something that we don't want individuals to result to. What did we bring to this debate? We talk about firstly how people are necessarily qualified, right? We tell you that individuals don't have the ability and the capacity to be qualified to treat themselves in situations like this. Kishan talked to you about the lack of awareness, and there's a bad perception that once you only have a severe amount of pain, you will only then go to a doctor. He told you about the harms, how this is a time-sensitive issue that individuals require this professionalism in their problems. But thirdly and most importantly, we also talked about traditional medicine, cultural medicine, also professional. There are irreversible harms to going through many methods. But lastly, we talked about how you devalue the entire research of medication in itself. When you choose to ignore the contributions and the entire research that you already had to make yourself and your life better through the problems that you necessarily have in your everyday life, you devalue all forms of research that they exist. We win this debate because you answered very simple. We responded to all their cases. We told you that it's not a harm of the Western drugs, more often than not, it's a harm of regulation. We provided you multiple levels of analysis as to why it's beneficial, because the doctor is more professional, he's more qualified than you, and certainly can tell you that you have a tumor instead of you thinking it's a headache.
To announce